Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for tuning back in to our series of town halls at the Muslim Legal Fund of America. Today, we have a very special guest, and our topic is Signs of the Times, Lessons from the College Admin Responses to the Campus Protests. And our guest today is Christina Jump. She brings more than 25 years of litigation experience. Her practice involves civil constitutional cases, including challenges to the no-fly list and other government watch lists, land use, religious discrimination in employment, religious accommodations in institutions, and defending denaturalization lawsuits on behalf of the Muslim community. Today, Christy serves as the Civil Litigation Department Head, and please join me in welcoming Christy to today's town hall.
Thank you, Bilal. Appreciate it. And I am excited to be here today and to discuss the topic that we have, which is signs of the times. What lessons can we learn from the reactions of college administrators to the protests that are happening all around the country at campuses, at different campuses? So let's go ahead and get right into it, and we'll go to slide number 2. So these are some of the recent headlines that have come up, which, if you take a look at these, is a lot of what's dominating the news and press coverage. Everything ranging from, well, first of all, it's a Time. The first one up there is a Time magazine article that recently came out of why colleges don't know what to do about campus protests, although they really should by now. There's been a lot of time in U.S. history for college campuses to practice how to respond to these and to figure it out. Police launched a violent crackdown on Gaza protests at campuses across the United States, which has many people saying, well, we're worried about another Kent state, which we'll talk about in a bit when we get a little further in, but worried about violence, worried about harm to the students, and worried about basically overreactions by a lot of college administration as well as local law enforcement who shows up. USC was one example where the police arrested 93 protesters and showed up with automatic weapons, used batons to subdue the protesters. At University of Texas, where state troopers were brought in, and not just local police for that. And a lot of the feedback that's coming up is that the overall response to these protests is only adding fuel to the fire, meaning making it worse, creating more tension, creating more dissension, creating a bigger divide, and making it so that nothing that is the point of the protest to begin with has been addressed. The students don't feel heard, they don't feel listened to, and now they're even more upset because they have to deal with criminal records or possibly threats to their education and figuring out where to go from there. Also, there have been allegations by both sides of inconsistency in how universities treat students who are outside of a protest versus another. And the tense protests have have led to allegations of trampling First Amendment rights. We represent students in several instances where we see that, where we believe that their First Amendment rights have been harmed or stifled when they should not have been, or where universities have violated Title VI, a federal statute which requires universities to treat all of its students equally. And in fact, anyone with access to the campus needs to be treated equally under Title VI, and the universities have a responsibility to provide a safe learning environment for the students. So let's go to the next slide and we'll get into where this is happening. I want to give, credit to The Guardian, and theguardian.com in its U.S. news section actually has quite a bit of information and resources. They even did a survey recently that came out that I don't have on the slide, but they did a survey that came out within the last week that showed that 97% of college campus protests that have happened in the United States, 97% of them have been peaceful. And yet that doesn't match the proportions that are being shown on the evening news in online publications, what the hubbub is, what you hear in Congress, coming out of Congress. You keep hearing about where there are problems, whether it's from counter protesters or from the original protesters, and that these 3% or less, according to the study by The Guardian, examples where there has been violence are supposedly enough to justify reducing free speech, reducing constitutional rights, and eliminating or greatly reducing the right to protest and the areas where people can protest, where students can protest. So, this map that we have here, which goes through the month of April, and I haven't found a more recently updated ones, but there are more. There would be more green dots proliferating across the country here. But this shows that there are protests literally happening from one coast to the other and at states in between. You can also see on here that it's not just in the um, Northeast and California. It's in Texas, it's in Florida, it's in a lot of the Midwestern states near the Great Lakes. There are quite a few protests again happening across the board in the United States on college campuses. The last number that I saw, which I believe was updated yesterday, was that there had been protests on 97 different college campuses across the country. So, with that in mind, it does affect the entire United States in one way or another. And let's go to the next slide and we'll start getting into what some of the examples are. So, there you'll see the news reaction of like, oh, this is unprecedented, this is unheard of. It's not unprecedented. It's very far from unprecedented in U.S. history. College campus protests are a significant part of U.S. history and have been for many decades. This goes back through, it's actually a very American thing to do throughout our U.S. history. So you can see the photos here, which represent in 1970, that's the Kent State protest. You see the armed military there from May 4th of 1970. You can see Berkeley is the middle picture from 1985, where there were protests against South African apartheid. And off to on the right of my screen, the other far end, the third picture is for protests that were happening at the tail end of the 70s and early 80s, again seeking divestment. And this particular one was at Harvard. So protests at Harvard are not anything new either. It's been quite a long history of that happening. I do want to give credit to the news sources that provided these images and where we found them. I do also want to say that you may hear some people saying, and I have heard on news reports, some saying this is again not necessarily unprecedented, but this is unlike anything we've ever seen before. And then others saying this is exactly like what we've seen before. So there's two different views here that I do want to run through in the bullet points on this slide in particular as well. There is an NYU professor who is quoted in a PBS.org article as saying, although it may be tempting to compare the nationwide campus protests to the anti-Vietnam War movement of half a century ago, that would be an overreaction. I would say this is the biggest in the United States in the 21st century for protests, but you could say that that's like being the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas, which is not known for its tall buildings. So the 21st century so far, in 20 years, I had 24 years, has not really had the chance to have a full base comparison. It may be the biggest example, the biggest time period that we've had of campus protests in the past 25 years, in the first quarter of this century. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened before. It doesn't mean that it hasn't happened on a broader scale before. It has. But others do see direct parallels between what's happening now and not even going back to Vietnam or to the 1950s and civil rights protests of the 50s and 60s, but looking back to the 80s, to the divestment protests, again, regarding South African apartheid and students who were divesting or who wanted divestment of their universities. So they were protesting, where students were protesting to try to convince universities to divest. And in fact, there were many people, many high ranking international people who did point out that They believe that the U.S. student protests on college campuses had a significant influence and had a significant impact on getting apartheid to end. Nelson Mandela himself had said that he thanked the United States college students for their protests against South African apartheid. So there is impact, certainly. There is precedent, certainly. So why are some of the colleges at least being reported to be acting as if they don't know what to do about this and they don't have a plan or a blueprint? Well, let's look at what they have done and what they are doing and then put that together for the lessons we can take from it. So if we can go to the next slide. So how did administrators react in the past? A lot of different ways, some more strongly than others. The photo is again from Harvard, and this is from 1965, protesting the Vietnam War. There's a protest at Harvard where students were protesting in Harvard Yard. That's not a new thing. It's happened before. And then the excerpt that you see there is talking about Columbia. We're going to talk about Columbia quite a bit today in this presentation. Just got a lot of good examples for us of college protests at Columbia. And this is an excerpt from an article stating that another difference that has struck many observers is the quick crackdown by campus authorities happening now in 2024 and with the pro-Palestinian protests. And if you look at this, you can see in the article quoted as saying that in 1968, students occupied Columbia's Hamilton Hall, which made the news again recently, for nearly a week before authorities came in, before police showed up, before Columbia University administration called on any kind of law enforcement to come in and to forcibly remove the students. The bust, when it did came, resulted in more than 700 people being arrested. That's much larger than the numbers that have been arrested thus far at Columbia. Not that it has to get to that level, but they waited a week. Back in 1968, when they had far more mass, a much larger mass, and a much greater number of students protesting than they do now. And so here's another quote of a student at Columbia saying, "It's funny because Columbia is very proud of its history and of Columbia's students' history of activism. A good number of students chose to go to Columbia because it's billed and has a reputation as being a place where you can have open discussions, a place where students can express their opinions and protest." The student who is now a senior at Barnard, its sister school, said that the administration's attitudes toward the modern day activists, at least in the eyes of protesters, are very ironic. They're so proud of their past protesters, but so violently repressive of the modern day protesters. So let's go to the next slide. So that's how administrators reacted previously. It was slower than they are now, even with larger numbers of protesters. How are administrators reacting now? Inconsistently. It is across the board. Some are reacting with violence and aggression, even where protesters are peaceful. That happened at the University of Texas, and in fact at multiple schools in Texas, despite the fact, incidentally, of the Texas governor having in 2009 encouraged the state legislature to pass, and it did pass, a free speech law that makes the entire First Amendment apply 100% directly to campuses within the state of Texas, whether they are public or private. So nonetheless, even with that free speech law being passed, the feedback is, or the approach now, is shut it down and send in as much military as possible, including state troopers. Others have responded with shifting rules. Those have been some of the complaints that you can read in articles and student papers coming out of places like Harvard, where students are saying that they don't know what the rules are. They try to follow the rules, and the universities give them a new set of rules. Other colleges have had that report too, or have had students making that same complaint as well. Some have reacted with patience and having force nearby in reach, but not necessarily on site. And where that has happened, there's been fewer clashes, but when riot gear is right around the corner, it's still not a very comforting feeling. and others have reacted with empathy. And we'll get to some of the most striking examples of that, where administrators have reacted with empathy toward the college students for why they're protesting. So let's go to the next slide. All right, here are again some of the examples. There is a letter that appeared in, I believe, the Wall Street Journal by the president of the University of Chicago, which had been holding off on physical force, responding to why I ended the University of Chicago protest encampment. And then also criticism and praise from of the governor of Texas for dramatic use of sending in state troopers on those who were very consistently reported to be peaceful protesters at the time. Violence erupts at UCLA, another headline recently. Police clear an occupied building at Columbia. Protests intensify. And then we have an outlier, seemingly, based on at least those that are making headlines. Sacramento State's unique approach helps bring a peaceful end to campus protests. So let's go to the next slide. So what's different between now and before? Well, here's another article that is amid campus protests nationwide, the reaction in Washington, D.C. stands out. It hasn't been without any force. It hasn't been without sending police in, but it definitely was different. Certainly not like the Texas governor sending in state troopers. Certainly not like what we saw happen at Columbia. And in D.C., they waited. Well, one of the reasons that they waited, here's another excerpt, hard lessons lead to changes. So one of the things that's different is that in Pershing Park protests, which happened a couple decades ago, the DC City Council in 2004 rewrote the rules that govern how police can handle protests. The law now prohibits police from rounding up protesters without giving them warnings, and without also, and this is very important, giving them a way out, without having to go through a line of police officers, potentially in riot gear. So they have to give them warnings. They have to give them a way out. They're not allowed to use handcuffs. They're not allowed to use zip ties. They're not allowed to hog tie students in custody once they're at a police processing center. The law banned also the use of riot gear when going in to break up a protest, unless the commanding officer had determined that there was specifically an imminent danger of significant violence. Not just we think they might be, not just sometimes protests get violent, but is there an imminent risk of violence and significant violence and a danger to the officers in the specific situation on the specific day that they're talking about? What ended up happening is that Washington, D.C. eventually had to settle several hundred lawsuits over past police tactics at protests, and it was to the tune of about $22 million. So D.C. changed its laws, and D.C. changed its practice, and at least started out more slowly and deliberately this time. I'm not saying it was all good, but more slowly and deliberately, and did do some things differently. So let's go to the next slide. So let's look at Columbia for another example. All right, so we have protests at Columbia often. I mean, that student that we just quoted is correct. Columbia has a long history of protests happening on its campus. Vietnam War protests in 1968. Students protested the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. They occupied several buildings on campus. The protest lasted a week before law enforcement was brought in. Some protesters suffered minor injuries, but that was it. And then there were anti-apartheid protests in 1984 that happened on the Columbia campus. Students were protesting and calling on Columbia to divest from any investments in South Africa. Demonstrators gathered at the entrance of Hamilton Hall, again, which came up again with the most recent protests at Columbia. And it's also one of the same buildings that had been occupied in 1968. So now we get to beginning at the end of 2023 and into 2024, weeks after October 7th, hundreds of students gathered at the center of protest, protesting Columbia's decision to suspend two student groups. Columbia suspended the student groups Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. for the semester, and students were protesting that. So they're saying, we stand with SJP, we stand with JVP. Those are parents in the picture who are protesting in support of the students as well. Not a new thing for there to be protests at Columbia. Let's go to the next slide. So if we continue looking at this, you can see on this slide here, if you look at what is different or the same at Columbia University for protest from 1968 as opposed to today. Well, there were more protesters in 1968. That's one of the things. Law enforcement was called in much faster now than it had been before. And so you can see going down that line, there are differences, but really the differences don't seem to add up to have a stronger, faster, more intense, and more violent police force go in. The actions in 1968 led to the report, this Cox Commission report. The cover of it is here. Analyzing what happened in April and May of 1968, crisis at Columbia, and fact-finding report of the commission that had been appointed to investigate the protests, the disturbances, and everything else that happened there. So let's go to the next slide. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, sorry, we're on the right one. Stay here. Thank you. Okay, so managing campus protests. These are some of the materials that have come out that have been made more that have been after the fact of prior protests. One of these, the first one here, is put out by the Department of Education, managing campus protests and demonstrations at HBCUs, at historically Black colleges and universities, and finding doing critical issues forums to get to the bottom of it. What can we find? What can we learn? As to law enforcement, executives, administrators, what can they learn? It was the National Center for Campus Public Safety that put out this report in 2018. And one of the quotes is that came out was the police chief saying, as a police chief, you need to understand the right to assemble. You need to understand the right to protest against the government. As a law enforcement officer, you have to protect the individual's rights to do that. And the conclusions were to deepen the relationships on campus between that's what was needed to be done, was to deepen the relationships on campus between law enforcement on site and the students so that they would feel heard. There's another quote there that sometimes you have to swallow your pride and find a way to bridge the gap with people. I think that's a really key finding there. Isn't necessarily being employed in everything that we're seeing today. But in the conclusion here, the excerpt with the conclusion, where you see the term CLE, that is campus law enforcement. That's what that stands for. So the conclusion was that there need to be stronger relationships. There needs to be more open lines of communications between the students and campus law enforcement, so that campus law enforcement will gain some element of trust with the students. If it's never there, if the only time that you see campus law enforcement is when they're coming to disperse an otherwise peaceful or lawful protest, that's not going to really lead to much solution. That's not the building a bridge that the gap there was discussing, and that this report on managing campus protests determined was something that needs to happen. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so we've looked at some examples from the past. Certainly there are many. This is not a new thing. We've looked at what's happening now on many campuses. So what does work and doesn't work? The executive summary from another report is that there just really needs to be a lot of communication, a lot more communication than there typically is between campus administration and students, and between campus law enforcement and students. And that can't all happen within a day. So if that ingredient isn't there to begin with, it's going to be a tough road, and it's not necessarily going to go smoothly. Investing the time all along in a relationship like that, and in discussions, even where there's disagreement, and allowing for disagreement and building in space for disagreement, is what really does work best. So some of the suggestions here are that there are going to be challenges to civil disobedience, but there's got to be a space and a place made for it. It can't be just to shut down free speech and that's it. It can't be just to shut down one opinion because others don't like it. That goes both ways. Both sides are allowed to voice their opinions. That is the heart of free speech on campus. Um, managing expectations, managing the buildings, looking at the timing, looking at the size, and where, and communicating all of this in advance. Again, communicating this clearly, making it something that's findable, so that students who want to protest are not surprised by it, and having events. Hopefully joint events, but at least recognizing that the right to have events is key also and is a form of free speech. So these are all the conclusions that came out that of things that need to happen, things that should be given attention. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so these are some key examples of what is happening on college campuses now, and some of these are very recent. So we look at this, the first private universities to reach what has been largely billed as settlements with the encampments. And I think that term's a bit off. I keep seeing it through the news. I don't think that's really the most accurate term. But they have had discussions and they've listened to the issues and they've found a resolution with the students, at least as a starting point. Brown University and Northwestern University were among the first to do this. And again, we're not looking at the same place. Brown University, that's Rhode Island. Northwestern University, that's Illinois. So we're not even looking at like one geographic area where this is happening. But they did that first, and they took the approach by saying that the administration would hold more discussions about divestment, withdrawal of financial investments in companies that contribute to Israel's war efforts, to the occupation in Palestine. And students then were willing to say, okay, well then at least for now, we're going to take down the encampments. There's a quote from the Northwestern president stating, "We thought the best way to sustainably de-escalate," and that's a key part right there that I want to stop at, to sustainably, ongoing de-escalate, not just clear the yard for a day, but sustainably de-escalate the situation, was to actually talk to the students. That's not me being sarcastic. Those are his words, which you can see right there. We thought the best way to sustainably de-escalate the situation was to actually talk to the students. Now, that should not be something that's coming across as a novel, unusual approach by a university president, but it is. We have a good sustainable agreement, which provides a number of things that the students want and that we want to do. So it's not being viewed where either side is having to admit defeat or either side is claiming pure victory. It's something where they've worked out a path to move forward, a way for the students to stay on campus, for the administration to continue to run the campus, and where both sides are getting some of what they want, and they've come up not with every answer. None of this says they've come up with every answer, but they've come up with a way to move forward. They've come up with basically rules and a timeline and things that are going to at least begin. And that's what's leading to the sustainable de-escalation, again, that the president of Northwestern University referred to. As part of the agreement, peaceful demonstrations are allowed. That shouldn't need to be part of a resolution agreement. That should just be. But it is important that the recognition is there. Students can peacefully protest. They're going to be allowed to leave up all of the tents through the end of classes, so through June 1st. So there are still encampments at Northwestern University today, even though they've reached a resolution among administration and students, because the students have a right to use those voices. Give students representation on an investment committee so the student voices can be heard on an ongoing basis, and pledging to bring Palestinian students to campus on fully funded scholarships. That was another key element of what the students felt was being not heard, being disregarded, being underrepresented. You can then look and see that below that there's Rutgers. Rutgers officials reached a deal with student protesters on May 2nd, and they credited constructive dialogue. Again, it's really not a mystery formula here. Any college administrator can go talk to the students instead of just sending in law enforcement. But at Rutgers, they said there was constructive dialogue between the protesting students and leadership teams. They opened the door for ongoing dialogue on the areas where they still hadn't reached agreement. And there's a large Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian student body at Rutgers that they wanted to address. So the school agreed to 8 out of 10 specific demands that the students had set forth. And those include accepting 10 displaced Palestinian students on scholarships to come to campus, developing a plan to build an Arab Cultural Center on campus, and exploring scholarly exchanges with a university in Ramallah, presuming one will be up and running. But to at least have students who were there do a scholarly exchange. I have to bring some professors over here. And then let's look also, most key, and why I have it off to the side on its own column here, Sacramento State University. Now that's the one that said Sacramento State University takes a novel approach. It was one of the first ones to do this. That president, Luke Wood, oversaw a peaceful end to campus protests, which began on April 29th and went through May 8th on that particular campus. The students issued a statement saying, "We want to take the time to thank Luke Wood for not following suit after other administrations and not calling the police on us." They felt that that was so novel that it warranted accolades for him. It warranted telling him thanks for not calling in the cops when we exercised our First Amendment rights. And the president, Luke Wood, this article notes that he had grown up in foster care. He had experienced hunger and homelessness. He said that he could relate to some of this. And he said, "I did 92 listening sessions, 92, not two, 92 listening sessions. Each one was more than 5 minutes by a long shot, 75 minutes apiece." And that ended up having him, the university president, speak directly to 1,500 students, faculty, and staff. They felt heard. And they came up with new policies. So we could go to the next slide. All right, so let's sum up for what works. Listening, go figure, it does. If you just sit down and talk to each other, it works. That's not a capitulation. That's not caving in of the universities. That's the universities listening to their student body, hearing what the concerns are, what the priorities are of the student body, listening to them, and agreeing to find a way to work together and to move forward. Tear gas does not work. No one in history has ever endured tear gas and then said, "Oh, now I agree, way deep down. I feel better. You changed my mind." All it's going to do is create more resentment, and it's going to create additional resentment. So there'll be layers upon there, and it'll create possibly a chilling effect. It might look good from the outside for a little bit, but it will come back, and it'll come back stronger. So there'll be more dissent, there'll be more disagreement, there'll be more unhappiness. Secrecy also does not work. Secrecy regarding investments and secrecy regarding what procedures relate to disciplinary processes and disciplinary policies. That's all got to be transparent. It should be anyway, so that students can know and students can make informed decisions on how they're going to act and what choices they're going to make. Making space to allow peaceful protests and recognizing free speech rights, that works. We saw that with Sacramento State and with several other examples, including Northwestern University. Creating safe spaces, Palestinian studies centers, Arab student centers, creating the exchanges with Palestinian students being able to come to campus, with other students being able to come to campus, and working with scholars from other universities. Those are the types of things that work. The final thing that I want to list here before we take some questions is that there's a quote that is from a 50-year-old survey, because again, or a 50-year-old report, a debrief looking after some past protests that had happened in the United States. Because again, as we've said throughout here, this is not new. Campus protests are not new. There is information to learn from. And one of the documents that's 50 years old specifically says universities should never take sides in a war, because students ought to have a right to express both viewpoints regarding any kind of a war. So, it's good advice that's contained in a 50-year-old document. Perhaps it should be worthy of a reprint and circulation. I think that could do a lot of good. Or just looking to the examples of the universities that are sitting down and talking to people. And so with that, I want to say thank you. This is our civil litigation department. They all play a role in creating our materials and helping everything that we do. All of our attorneys within the department in civil litigation help when we do represent students, when we take on these sorts of things, when we do any of the work that we do. And so I want to give a thanks to all of them.
Christy, thank you so much.
Mhm.
I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate the case studies that you brought up of different university administrators and the approaches that they took to successfully listen and to be able to create that dialogue and that safe space. So I really appreciate that. A couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The first one being, are there some states, perhaps it's law enforcement or government, that have more strict policies than others, and if so, why?
There are some that are more strict than others, and a lot of people are pointing to politics. That's some of it, but also if you look, for example, at the University of Chicago, so not University of Illinois, but University of Chicago, there are more restrictions on protesting, on where, when, and how protests can happen that have been in place for a long time, that are not reactionary to the protests happening now. Part of the reason for that is that it's in the middle of a big city where the campus is not by any means comprising a majority of what's happening around it. So, in conjunction with the city of Chicago, there are more restrictions on protests that can happen there. And that makes sense and that's legitimate. It's also known. So there can be some differences there. Whereas what you're seeing, as far as, by way of contrast to that, Sacramento State University listening, sitting down from the beginning versus sending in state troopers storming to an otherwise peaceful protest, that's not because of any particular state law. And, in fact, as we mentioned briefly earlier, the state of Texas has more laws protecting free speech on campus and protecting the rights of students to free speech on campus. Yet the governor sent in state troopers as well as I believe it was 4 or 5 other law enforcement agencies as well to address protests there that were largely peaceful.
And on what grounds could students possibly be suspended or disciplined, or perhaps even have their degrees withheld for participating or protesting?
There's a lot of that coming up, and we've seen that with some of our clients as well. We've seen also a lot of reports of that happening at various campuses. There have to be clearly communicated policies that were clearly communicated in advance and that make it known to the students again so they can make informed decisions, that they can do X, they cannot do Y. Again, the University of Chicago is an example of one that does have those clear policies, and for legitimate reasons. So if a student were to violate one of those clearly communicated and long-standing things, then that would be something where they potentially could be disciplined more harshly, or that might be considered a violation of a student code of conduct, because they've already signed on to those, presumably, and been notified of them specifically in advance. What is not appropriate is taking an area where free speech has been allowed before, where protests, where demonstrations, where tables, where teach-ins, where any kind of public gathering or student gathering has been allowed before, and now all of a sudden it's not, and issuing a statement that, yeah, but not now. That's something that really students should not be subjected to, and it likely won't hold up long term. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of these students, these are short term consequences that will have a long term impact on them because we're in the month of May. We're in graduation month.
And I'd like to invite you to share a little bit more about the case with the Harvard student clients and the settlement with the university. Can you maybe share some news or some updates about that?
I can share some updates. I can talk about some of that. We filed, just to recap, or for those who may not know, we filed a charge of discrimination with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights in January on behalf of more than a dozen students at Harvard who have not been individually named, so I'm not going to individually identify them here either. But in that regard, we had that filed in January. The Department of Education almost immediately opened an investigation, and we know that to be ongoing. We know that the Department of Education is looking at Harvard for systemic violations, and investigating whether there is, anything to that and anything Harvard needs to change. And then, we saw, as many people have seen in the news, that Harvard suspended students engaged in protesting, put them on an involuntary leave, I believe is the term that was publicly reported. And then, but that also included letters sent with the same leave to, I guess, a student paper reported it included a student reporter who was there to report on the protests. It included some who had been just walking by on the sidewalk. So there were allegations of there being a lot of different students in different capacities who were impacted, that it wasn't uniformly or even clearly applied, even if it was a valid move to begin with. And then there was a settlement reached where Harvard stated publicly in many publications that Harvard would rescind the suspensions, the involuntary suspensions. So it would take those away. And it would work, I believe the term they used was expeditiously to resolve resulting disciplinary action, disciplinary board, advisory board actions against the students. So hopefully Harvard will stick to that, will stick to what it said, and will do that expeditiously without causing any greater harm, to any of the students who are involved. I will also say that is not a settlement of the Title VI complaint that we filed with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. That is unaffected by the settlement that Harvard reached. That remains ongoing. So it is just a different column, a different box.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that update. I know a lot of our supporters have been following the story, and for us to hear it here today in terms of the progress that's being made, and how we continue to pursue justice for our students at Harvard and other campuses as well. So, Christy, I want to thank you on this Friday to take out time from your afternoon, evening, to share these updates with us, to share these insights with us, to guide our students, to guide the parents of university students. And so thank you for joining us today. And to thank you to all of our viewers who have logged in this week. We have 2 more town halls coming up. And as you see on the next slide, or actually, sorry, 3 more. No, it's 2 more.
Oh, no, I think we're one of them.
Yeah. So 2 more. And they'll be taking place Monday and Tuesday. So please continue to come and join us. And for those of us that are familiar with the Muslim Legal Fund, the Muslim Legal Fund is a nonprofit, full-service defense fund dedicated to defending Muslim civil rights and liberties at a federal level. We count on your support, your prayers. So please continue to donate. Please continue to attend and continue to spread the word so we can continue to defend those that are in need. Thank you so much. We'll see you back on Monday and again on Tuesday. Have an amazing weekend.